After my time with the Churchill River study on this archaeology crew, I had an opportunity, which to me was just a fabulous opportunity, not to be missed. Through the director of that crew had a friend who was a PhD student at Cornell, Leslie Sponsel, who was looking for a research assistant for a project on cultural ecology with Sanema, a subgroup of Yanomamö in Venezuela, in the more southeasterly portion of the Orinoco watershed, very close to the border with Brazil in the Guyana highlands. And I went for a few months of work, sometime at the Venezuelan Institute for Scientific Investigations. EVIC is the acronym from the Spanish, outside Caracas. And then a few months up the Caura, one of the major tributaries of the Orinoco, where we lived with Sanema for a few months and did a style of not cultural ecology in the Julian Stewart sense, but a kind of a more combination of cultural and biological or ecological work on Sanema gardening and hunting and fishing. It was quite familiar to me, having been exposed to Marvin Harris's approach to really documenting things in minute material detail, and there was quite a bit of that with this research. But Leslie was, I would say, more kind of broad-minded than maybe Marvin Harris. He wasn't a radical determinist, but he thought it was really important to document all of these gardening practices and hunting practices, and of course he was reading people like Roy Rappaport, that work in New Guinea, and wanted also to get at the sort of institutional and symbolic aspects that went with these more material practices. We ended up caught in a bit of a political problem. Well, more than a bit of a political problem. It became quite decisive for my career. I came back from Venezuela after about 6 months. I was out of money. Leslie had provided some support, but he had limited support, and I very much wanted to go back. So I came back to Canada, and I got a job with the Department of Northern Saskatchewan, partly through network that I'd developed on the Churchill River study. The Department of Northern Saskatchewan was this NDP experiment in developing the subarctic portion of Saskatchewan. Very much seeing it as a kind of an integrated social mission. It's an odd thing to have a government department that focuses on a geographic area, but the idea was that you would orchestrate political and economic, especially community development kinds of perspectives into a concerted effort to develop the North. And so in that sense, it was a fairly conventional vision of development and progress for Indian and Métis communities. And Saskatchewan was a very heavy, very large majority, and is, of Cree and Chipewyan and Métis communities. And often the Métis communities side by side, typically the Métis communities side by side with their Cree or Chipewyan counterparts, but because they weren't considered at some point in their ancestry, they were dislodged from the category of registered Indians because of having a paternal white somewhere in the lineage, ended up in communities adjacent to reserve communities, completely intermarried, as fluent in Cree or Chipewyan as their reserve counterparts, but because they were considered mixed bloods, they had this different status. So the Department of Northern Saskatchewan was particularly focused on the Métis communities because, of course, Indian Affairs was responsible for the Indian communities. So I had a very interesting engagement with various community development conversations and initiatives over the course of a year. But my goal was to raise enough money to go back to Venezuela. I wasn't at that stage, I have to confess, I wasn't set on a career in anthropology. I wasn't sure I wanted to go to graduate school. Actually, I saw graduate school as a possible means of staying in the places that I wanted to be in. I was very attracted to the idea of hunting, fishing, trapping in northern Saskatchewan. I actually could quite happily have gone into that as my life. And I was very fascinated with the lives of rainforest hunters in Venezuela. That was a very strong attraction. Those were the things that really motivated me at that time. Now, personal factors enter decision making in interesting ways. I know I was my marriage at the time was to a woman who was not at all interested in living as the partner of a hunter in northern Saskatchewan or Venezuela. And that was a factor which eventually moved me to graduate studies. Because it was a way that she could have her kind of career path satisfied, and I mine. So let me just say a little bit about what fascinated me about Sanomamö. These guys were masters of their environment with nothing like the amount of consumer goods that subarctic Crees were, involved in after nearly 3 centuries of involvement with, well, in the case of northern Saskatchewan, not 3 centuries maybe, but well over 2 centuries of involvement with the fur trade. Masters in their own right, but already with a lot of very familiar equipment, rifles, outboard engines, and so on. Sanema, when you went hunting with a group of Sanema men, say 3 or 4 guys decide we're going hunting for a week. We're going to go hunt peccary. That would be the main game. They would leave the village with a bow, some arrows, a bamboo tube on a cord around their neck with different points, poison points for monkeys, lanceolate points for peccary, different kind of point for birds. 1 or 2 of them would have a knife on their belt, but not necessarily all of them. Somebody might carry a machete. One of them might have a coal wrapped in green leaves in the tube around his neck so that it would be easier to start a fire. That was it. They'd just walk out of the village and be gone. And I mean, we'd go with them. We'd do our best to keep up. So that degree of autonomy, the mastery of environment, that you could get by with that little material accoutrement. Didn't even take hammocks with them. When they wanted to sleep, there was a certain kind of tree with a very smooth bark, very fibrous bark. And they'd girdle the tree high, they'd girdle it low, and they'd cut a big rectangle of bark, a huge rectangle of bark, and then they'd separate it into cords. They'd tie some vine around each end, and presto, they've got a hammock. And the next morning, they leave it. Like, we'll make another one next night. If it rained, no problem. They'd tie the ends of their hammock. They'd hang the hammock. Both ends of the hammock would hang from a stout branch, and they would cocoon themselves under 3 or 4 big leaves and stay dry. Maybe if it was really chilly, they'd put their hammocks in a triangle shape and have a fire going for warmth, and each guy would take a turn putting a bit more wood on the fire to keep it going through the night. I was enthralled by that minimalist ability to survive and be comfortable, not just survive, but to be very happy and comfortable with almost nothing. And I really wanted to acquire those skills. I didn't just want to observe and write about them. That's always been my kind of nature. I want the competency, you know. So it was a bare beginning, really. Those kinds of things come after years, not months, those skills. So there I was in northern Saskatchewan doing my community development work, dreaming of going back to Venezuela, and partly to satisfy my then wife, decided, okay, graduate studies. She was going to do a degree in fine arts, and I was going to, embark on a graduate career in anthropology, so I could do these things. I mean, there was a political side to it in those days as well. And I think that went back in some ways to my childhood, realizing how easily displaced these ways of life can be, and valuing them. I was very much looking for ways to defend those spaces. The community development work in Saskatchewan was somewhat informed by that. Hunting, fishing, trapping remained a very important part of the economy of the Cree and Chipewyan and Métis economy in northern Saskatchewan. So that was always part of your thinking about development, or development alternatives, or as become a more common phrasing in Latin American studies today, alternatives to development. Let's just dispense with development altogether. So that was a factor, but it's a funny story, and I should. I guess I need to explain a little bit of how I got dislodged from Amazonia and ended up in the subarctic. While we were in the Upper Caura, while we learned about this development while we were at EVIC, at the Venezuelan Institute of Scientific Research. The Ministry of Justice in Venezuela, which was a much more intact society politically in those days than it is today, or less fraught at least, was just embarking on a program of recognition of, or dealing with Aboriginal title in some way. They didn't have a very clear idea yet about how they were going to do that. But there was a national aspiration to develop the Amazon. And as part of that, they understood that they were going to have to deal with some pretty formidable groups. The Yanomamö were the kind of really back of beyond. They were the most remote of those and the least known. But there was another powerful group, Yakwana, who also known as Makiratari or Maingong, on both sides of the Venezuelan-Brazilian border. So there's this kind of ecological zoning where on the smallest headwaters and the uplands, there were Yanomamö, but on the lower courses of the tributaries of the Orinoco on the Venezuelan side and the Amazon on the Brazilian side, there were Yakwana. And these guys had big villages and major gardens, and they were taking goods to the Creole market downriver. They were lords and masters politically. Because of their village size. And they also controlled the flow of any trade goods into Yanomamö territory. So when the Ministry of Justice started having conversations with Yakwana and trying to have conversations with Yanomamö and other groups on the frontier, Yakwana saw an opportunity to keep Yanomamö in a subordinate position. Yanomamö would sometimes work in the gardens or would work as porters on the downriver expeditions for Yakwana in exchange for an old shotgun or a shirt or some metal pots, knife, axe, various things that they coveted made life easier in hunting and fishing. But the Yanomamö were quite aware that the Yakwana were fancied themselves to be dominant, politically superior, and Yakwana, for their part, were developing a narrative that Yanomamö were on Yakwana land, and that, after all, Yanomamö were just recently arrived in Venezuela from the Brazilian side. And I mean, it was a complete fiction, but it was, fairly common, when people are making land grabs. So Yanomamö knew that Yakwana were not to be trusted. They weren't idiots. They were simply disadvantaged geographically. They didn't speak any Spanish. Yakwana, on the other hand, there was a fairly large factor of bilingual ability to function quite well in Spanish, and some fairly well-educated Yukwana in the institutional sense. There was one young man in the village that we worked in, and this would not have been the case in some of the neighboring Yanomamö villages, but there was one young man, because his father was Yukwana, but his mother was Yanomamö, had been to a mission school and spoke a little bit of Spanish. And he was our interpreter. And the village decided that he was going to become a leader. He was loyal to, his sense of himself was that he was Sanema through his mother. And the village understood that a lack of Spanish was a liability politically for them. They wanted to be able to interact directly with the Ministry of Justice and not have Yukwana speaking for them. So they invited Leslie and myself to teach. They wanted us to teach Spanish to the school-age children in the village. And they asked us to take this young man, well, he was 15 or 16 at the time, Wanima. They said, when you go down river to Caracas, take him with you, introduce him to the Ministry of Justice people, start networking, because we need a spokesperson. So we agreed. But it turned out to be the end of our research in that area, because when Yukwana found out, Yanomamö, I was coming back to Canada to earn more money. Leslie was going down to Caracas for another stay at the Venezuelan Institute of Scientific Research before he would go back to the field. And so I came back to Canada, was in northern Saskatchewan, and I hear from Les that he was in Caracas with Wanima, like we went down the river together, the three of us. But when he tried to go back, Yukwana had discovered that this village that we were working in, Tacaranya, was building a little schoolhouse in the middle of the plaza where we were going to be teaching Spanish upon our return, our respective return. Les went back sooner, of course, because he had funding, but I had to, my plan was to come back in a few months or a year. So the Yukwana said to Les, when he went back up, "You're done. Our next expedition downriver is in, I think it was 6 weeks or something, and you're going to be on it, and we don't want to see you again in our territory." So this was a problem. It did force Les to wrap up his field work earlier than he had intended. To me, it was not insurmountable because there was a missionary airstrip on the next watershed, and there was a 3-day walk that I could do over back to the village, and I didn't have to go through Yukwana to get there. But the more serious problem was that once these political tensions emerged in the territory, our sponsors at EVIC, at the institute outside Caracas, which incidentally at the time was directed by a woman who was the wife of the senior guy in the Ministry of Justice who was looking after Indigenous matters. The institute informed me that if I wanted to go back to do research, I was going to have to get an institutional affiliation in Canada, and I was going to have a supervisor who was an anthropologist of the Amazonian region.